There is a narrative you have likely recited to yourself in the quiet hours of the night, perhaps after the ashes of yet another ruined attachment have grown cold. You tell yourself that you are merely the victim of unfortunate circumstances, that fate has cursed you with an uncanny propensity for drawing the wrong human beings into your orbit. You reflect upon the sequence of faces that have occupied your past, the one whose vanity devoured every room they entered, the one whose interior doors remained perpetually locked, the one whose insatiable demands drained your reservoir until you were dry, and the one whose cold withdrawal left you shivering in emotional starvation. You have dissected these autopsies of the heart with friends. You have analyzed their flaws with intellectual precision. You have stood amid the wreckage and sworn with the solemnity of a sacred vow that you would never again allow yourself to be led into such a desolate country. And yet, after a season of silence, you found yourself standing in the very same landscape once more. The face was entirely different. The voice possessed an unfamiliar timbre. The biographical details shared no common history with the past, and you possessed an elaborate catalogue of reasons why this time was entirely rational and pure. But beneath the novel surface, the rhythm of the tide remained unchanged. Soon enough, there was the same suffocating tension, the same familiar exhaustion, and that slow, insidious erosion of something essential within your core, a quiet dissolution of your own sovereignty that you cannot easily name, but which you recognize with a sudden, sickening clarity. When people came to me in Zurich, burdened by the repetitive tragedies of their romantic lives, they always arrived with the same desperate inquiry. They wanted to know why others had inflicted such profound suffering upon them. But in the consulting room, that is never the question that opens the gateway to the truth. The genuine question, the only one capable of rending the veil, is far more unsettling. Why do you persistently participate in the construction of the very temple that collapses upon you? Throughout my decades of mapping the uncharted terrain of the human psyche, I was rarely interested in the rationalizations people offer for their conscious decisions. What a person believes they are choosing when they step into love is almost always an illusion, a polite fiction constructed by the conscious ego to conceal a far deeper, subterranean drama. The human mind is not an isolated, rational engine. It is an ancient vessel governed by invisible currents, archetypal currents, and unresolved wounds that exert an immense gravitational force. What I discovered across a lifetime of clinical observation was not flattering to human vanity. The vast majority of men and women do not choose their partners in freedom. They are seized. They are drawn into intricate relational mazes by unconscious projections, by unintegrated components of their own souls, and by psychological dynamics so ancient and deeply buried that they mistake them for personal taste, for chemical attraction, or for the sublime mystery of romantic destiny. Among the countless configurations through which human beings encounter one another, I identified 4 specific relationship dynamics that systematically dismantle the individual soul. They do not operate with dramatic, overt violence. They do not announce their presence with immediate catastrophe. Instead, they work quietly across years and decades through psychological mechanisms so comfortable and familiar that they are rendered virtually invisible. The profound danger of these relationships lies precisely in how they announce themselves at the threshold. They do not feel dangerous in the beginning. On the contrary, they feel like the arrival of salvation. They feel like a profound homecoming, like the sudden and miraculous resolution of an ancient loneliness, like the most vivid, electrifying state of vitality you have ever known. You must understand this with absolute clarity. That overwhelming feeling is not an accident of nature. It is a psychological mechanism, and it is operating with flawless, ruthless efficiency. What modern therapeutic culture often hesitates to articulate plainly is that your repetitive romantic disasters are not random misfortunes visited upon you by an uncaring cosmos. They are symptoms. They are the externalized representations of an internal fracture. They point directly to something unbuilt within your own architecture, some essential territory of your interior life that you have refused to inhabit and which you have been desperately attempting to outsource to another human being. The central task of human existence, the arduous journey toward wholeness, which I termed the process of individuation, requires the gradual birth of a distinct, differentiated, and conscious self. These four destructive dynamics exist for the precise purpose of preventing that birth. They are the ego's most sophisticated defenses against the terrifying labor of self-realization. You are not an innocent bystander crushed beneath the wheels of another person's pathology. You are an unconscious collaborator in an ancient, recurring script. And the moment you recognize the boundary between being a victim of fate and being a participant in a pattern, the entire world shifts beneath your feet. What we must explore together is not a superficial taxonomy of difficult personalities. It is something considerably more demanding, an unsparing examination of the manner in which your own psyche conspires against your consciousness, and the four distinct crucibles where that inner conspiracy results in the slow, silent forfeiture of your life. It is the kind of destruction that does not leave visible scars upon the body, but causes you to awake after 20 years to discover that the person looking back at you from the glass is an absolute stranger. Let us begin with the first, and perhaps the most widespread, of these psychological labyrinths, the illusion of the mirrored soul. You do not fall in love with another mortal. You fall in love with the unlived potential of your own soul cast outward upon a living screen. This is not a cynical denigration of human affection. It is the most precise and unsettling reality of our psychological structure. When an individual has failed to cultivate certain vital dimensions of their own interior life, when their own courage, their own creative power, their own capacity for depth or authority remains asleep in the dark basement of the unconscious, those qualities do not simply vanish. The unconscious psyche cannot tolerate an internal vacuum. Whatever remains unexpressed within you is automatically projected onto the outer world. It wanders through the crowd until it finds an appropriate screen, fixes itself upon a human face, and demands that you worship it under the sacred name of romantic love. In my investigations into the architecture of the soul, I designated these inner archetypal structures as the anima in the masculine psyche and the animus in the feminine. These are not mere poetic metaphors, nor are they intellectual abstractions. They are living, dynamic, structural organs of the collective unconscious. They are the accumulated emotional and psychological templates of every ancestor who ever lived, loved, feared, and yearned across uncounted millennia. They exist within the dark waters of your unconscious mind, fully formed, waiting with immense psychic charge. When a person crosses your path who happens to possess the physical resonance, the psychological tone, or the symbolic posture that aligns with this internal archetype, the projection discharges with the instantaneous force of lightning. The experience is staggering. It carries the weight of numinous revelation. It feels as though the heavens have parted, as though the universe itself orchestrated the meeting across time and space, as though you have finally met the half of your soul that was severed at the dawn of creation. That violent, intoxicating sensation is not destiny. It is the sudden, explosive confrontation with your own unintegrated psyche. The diagnostic markers of this state are unmistakable to anyone who has studied the unconscious mind. The idealization of the other is entirely disproportionate to any objective reality. The beloved appears not merely as a flawed human being with virtues and limitations, but as an extraordinary, singular figure, possessing an aura of perfection that renders the rest of existence dull and grey. Your emotional equilibrium, your sense of personal meaning, your creative energy, and the very foundation of your daily stability begin to orbit their approval like a desperate planet around a blazing sun. You no longer merely desire their companionship, you experience an existential panic at their absence. Your former interests wither. Your friendships drift into irrelevance. The life you spent decades building begins to look like nothing more than an empty anteroom where you sat waiting for the real drama to commence. And then, with the mathematical certainty of psychological law, reality makes its brutal entrance. It must. A projection cannot eat dinner, it cannot pay the bills, and it cannot sustain the friction of ordinary days. The person onto whom you cast your divine garment inevitably displays a moment of petty selfishness, an ordinary failure of courage, a common human irritability, or a mundane contradiction. And in that single moment, your entire internal world undergoes a catastrophic collapse. You feel profoundly betrayed, yet if you are entirely honest with yourself, they have not failed you as a human being. They have simply failed to remain a god. They have committed the unpardonable sin of being mortal. The golden palace you inhabited was never built upon the ground of their actual character. It was a luminous film projected from your own interior lamp onto the blank canvas of their presence. When the light flickers, or when the screen steps aside, the image vanishes, leaving you standing in the cold dust of an empty room. Consider the immense psychological cost of this dynamic. Every month, every year that you spend kneeling before the projection of your own unrealized nature is a year stolen from your own psychological maturation. Every ounce of brilliance, every nuance of emotional depth, every boundary of strength that you idolized in that other person was a direct reflection of a latent capacity sleeping within your own chest, a capacity that you were terrified to cultivate yourself. Projection is a form of spiritual cowardice. It is the outsourcing of your own heroic labor to an external proxy. It allows you to feel the sublime glow of wholeness without having to endure the agonizing, solitary work of becoming whole. When such a relationship fractures, the agony you feel is not merely the grief of loss. It is the sudden, terrifying demand for payment on an immense psychological debt that has accumulated in secret. The path of liberation from this dynamic does not lie in searching for a more flawless screen upon which to cast your next fantasy. It begins with the unflinching courage to turn your gaze backward into the projector itself. You must ask the agonizing question, what specific gold did I perceive in their eyes that left me trembling with awe? What unlived sovereignty, what buried passion, what wild or disciplined power did they embody that I have refused to forge within my own soul? For those qualities were never theirs to begin with. They were the neglected treasures of your own unlived life, waiting for you to stop worshipping them in another and finally claim them as your own. Yet, there is a second dynamic, equally pervasive and far more insidious, where the tragedy is not that you project your soul onto another, but that you dissolve the very boundaries of your existence until neither you nor the other can be said to exist at all. Most men and women live under the tragic delusion that the complete eradication of personal boundaries is the highest expression of romantic love. They call this state intimacy, but it is the precise opposite of intimacy. Genuine intimacy is an act of profound conscious courage. It requires two distinct, differentiated and sovereign souls who stand firmly upon their own ground, and from that position of solitary strength, consciously choose to draw near to one another. What passes for intimacy in the majority of human entanglements is nothing more than psychological fusion, an unconscious collapse of the psychic distance that alone makes love, respect, and communion possible. In my anthropological and psychological research, I relied heavily upon a concept observed by Lucien Levy-Bruhl, participation mystique. This term describes an archaic primordial state of consciousness wherein an individual possesses no clear distinction between themselves and their external environment, or between their own mind and the mind of another. In the early months of infancy, this state is biologically and psychologically necessary. The infant and the mother exist within an undivided oceanic continuity. The fragile, nascent ego of the child has not yet separated from the matrix of the maternal unconscious. However, what I observed repeatedly throughout decades of clinical work is that an astonishing number of adults never successfully complete that crucial differentiation. Chronologically, they may possess the bodies, the professions, and the legal standing of mature individuals. Psychologically, they remain stranded in the symbiotic ocean of early childhood. They enter the romantic arena carrying an immense, unhealed hunger for merger, and they magnetically attract partners who harbor the identical wound. When observed from within, this state of psychic fusion does not present itself as an illness. On the contrary, it masquerades as the most sublime telepathic connection imaginable. You take immense pride in the fact that you can sense their shifting moods before a single word is uttered. You make no choice, from the most trivial daily preference to the trajectory of your vocation, without first seeking their implicit emotional sanction. Any divergence of thought, any solitary interest, or any subtle disagreement produces an instantaneous flare of visceral anxiety, a guilt so sharp that it functions precisely like physical pain. In a fused dynamic, difference is perceived as betrayal, and psychological separateness is experienced as the terror of absolute abandonment. The relationship gradually transforms into a hermetically sealed container. Outside, friendships wither away under an unspoken suspicion. Family ties are severed or viewed as hostile intrusions. External intellectual or creative pursuits are quietly abandoned because they threaten the fragile, absolute monopoly of the shared psychic field. The pronoun I slowly atrophies from disuse, replaced by a suffocating, omnipotent we. You reach a point where you cannot discern whether the sadness in your chest belongs to you or was absorbed from the atmosphere of the other person. The psychological devastation wrought by this condition is profound. Fusion does not expand the self, it arrests it in a state of perpetual infantilism. True psychological growth, the severe labor of individuation, requires tension, friction, solitude, and the solitary endurance of one's own unique suffering. When you are fused with another human being, all internal development grinds to an absolute halt. You cannot forge strength when you never have to stand upright under your own weight. You cannot develop a moral compass when your values are merely the reflex of another's expectations. The fused individual does not become more whole through the partnership. They become progressively more fragile, more terrified of reality, and increasingly incapable of existing as an autonomous entity in the world. The catastrophe inevitably arrives when the relationship is subjected to the unavoidable pressures of life. If the partner leaves, if they die, or if they merely attempt to assert their own long-overdue need for air, the fused individual suffers a total psychic collapse. They do not merely grieve the loss of a companion, they experience the absolute dissolution of their reality. They look within themselves and find nothing, no ground, no center, no history, no sovereign voice, only a vast, terrifying void where a human soul was supposed to have been constructed. The liberation from this archaic swamp is not a descent into cold cynicism or emotional isolation. It is the terrifying, necessary act of psychological differentiation. It requires you to learn how to inhabit an opinion that offends the other, to sit alone in a quiet room without the desperate compulsion to seek reassurance, and to allow the other person to experience their own pain without rushing to absorb it as your own. When you begin to draw a boundary around your soul, the initial sensation will not be peace. It will be acute, trembling guilt. But you must understand that this guilt is not a sign that you have committed a sin against love. It is the birth pang of an autonomous self. Only when two people possess the strength to stand completely alone in the wilderness of their own existence can they truly look across the clearing and choose to walk together. Yet there is a third condition, distinct in its architecture, where the danger is neither the fantasy of projection nor the drowning of fusion, but a slow, systematic, and metabolic exhaustion of your very life force. There is a particular category of human entanglement that begins not with an explosion of passion, but with the quiet, seductive gratification of being desperately needed. For a vast number of human beings whose early development was marked by emotional neglect, being necessary is the closest approximation to being loved they have ever experienced. They do not realize that there is a profound, cosmic gulf between being cherished for the reality of who you are and being utilized as a vital resource for another's psychic survival. By the time this distinction becomes undeniable, the structural foundation of your life has already been hollowed out. You find yourself burdened not by the acute fatigue of a difficult day, but by a chronic, pervasive grayness, a deep cellular exhaustion that becomes your permanent baseline. You move through your days with an internal flatness, your creative appetite extinguished, carrying the haunting sensation that your vital energy does not belong to you, but exists merely to be consumed by an insatiable, external hunger. This is the psychological reality of what must be termed psychic parasitism. It is not an overt, dramatic act of cruelty. It is a quiet, continuous extraction of psychic energy, or what I termed libido, operating beneath the polite surface of everyday life. To comprehend why this occurs, one must understand that an individual who has failed to construct a stable, cohesive internal center, whose ego is fragmented, whose shadow remains utterly unintegrated, and whose connection to their own archetypal roots is severed, cannot generate psychic vitality from within. They are perpetually bankrupt in their own interior economy. Consequently, they must sustain their psychological existence by harvesting the vitality, the attention, the stability, and the emotional resonance of those around them. The dynamic unfolds with a predictable, exhausting rhythm. Every interaction, no matter how casually it begins, is drawn into the gravitational field of their perpetual turmoil. If you attempt to voice your own sorrow, your own fatigue, or your own need for sanctuary, the subject is instantly, almost magically, inverted and redirected back toward their own suffering. Their existence is an endless procession of manufactured emergencies, acute dilemmas, and emotional collapses, each one demanding your immediate presence, your undivided attention, and the total suspension of your own life. And when you arrive, when you pour out your time, your wisdom, and your emotional reserves to steady their ship, there is never any genuine resolution. The crisis never leads to insight. It never produces maturity. It merely subsides for a brief hour, only to reconstitute itself in a new form tomorrow. The gratitude you receive is thin and fleeting because the parasitic structure does not seek a cure. It seeks a continuous supply. What renders this dynamic so difficult to dismantle is that it is invariably cloaked in the sacred language of moral duty and profound empathy. You are told, either directly or through the subtle art of emotional manipulation, that your availability is the measure of your goodness, that your fatigue is a manifestation of selfishness, and that any attempt to establish a perimeter around your own soul is an act of unforgivable cruelty. If you were raised with the unconscious belief that your right to exist on this earth must be earned through self-effacement, this manipulation will strike your soul with the force of an absolute command. You will surrender your marrow and call it devotion. You must recognize that the individual engaged in this extraction is often not consciously calculating their maneuvers. They are operating from a condition of genuine internal bankruptcy. But understanding the clinical mechanics of their deficit does not mean you must allow yourself to be consumed by it. Explanation is not absolution, nor is it an obligation to be sacrificed upon an altar of perpetual dysfunction. The diagnostic criterion I would urge you to examine is not the dramatic rhetoric exchanged during their moments of catastrophe, but the ordinary, mundane quality of your soul in the quiet moments that follow. When you leave their presence after an ordinary conversation, after a standard afternoon, do you feel an expanded sense of vitality, or do you feel as though the light within your own house has been dimmed? That quiet, bodily truth tells you everything you need to know. Setting a boundary within this dynamic will never lead to mutual understanding or quiet reflection. It will inevitably trigger an escalation of the drama, a louder proclamation of victimhood, and an intensified assault upon your guilt. If your boundaries have repeatedly collapsed under this assault, it is because you have not yet cured yourself of the vanity of being the savior. The only genuine exit from this psychological drain is complete, uncompromising withdrawal. You cannot negotiate terms with an extraction mechanism. You can only starve it by removing your presence entirely. And this brings us to the fourth structural tragedy, the dynamic wherein you are trapped not merely by another's hunger, but by your own unconscious compulsion to assume the mantle of the parent in a world of supposed equals. There is a profound and desolate exhaustion that arises when you are forced to carry a weight that was never ordained for your shoulders. You recognize this burden in the chronic vigilance that defines your presence within the relationship. You are perpetually anticipating the next disaster, continuously organizing the chaos they leave in their wake, regulating the volatile emotions they refuse to master, and quietly absorbing the real-world consequences of their absolute refusal to mature. Without ever having signed a conscious contract and without any deliberate intention, you have gradually ceased to be a partner, a lover, or an equal companion. You have become the solitary adult in a relationship between two grown human beings. This dynamic represents a catastrophic failure of individuation rooted in the preservation of an infantile psychology. When a human being attains biological maturity without achieving psychological maturity, their inner child does not dissolve. It remains active in the unconscious, terrified of the demands of reality, searching frantically for a parental surrogate who will provide the containment, the discipline, the emotional regulation, and the structural scaffolding that their own development failed to construct. If you possess an unconscious predisposition toward caretaking, you will step into this vacant parental seat with an immediate, fatal fluency. In the beginning, this role will feel intoxicating. It will feel like profound significance, like being the indispensable pillar of another's world, like the highest form of love. But in truth, it is not a relationship at all. It is a functional role, and roles do not possess the capacity for love, for mystery, or for mutual growth. The degradation occurs with agonizing subtlety. The infantile partner collapses over the standard frictions of life, a minor professional setback, an administrative task, an uncomfortable social interaction, and you instinctively step forward to absorb the shock, calibrate their emotions, and solve the problem. In doing so, you slowly transform your own life into an unpaid managerial service for another person's psyche. And what is the reward for this immense labor? It is never gratitude or reciprocal care. The moment you fail to manage their reality with absolute perfection, or the moment you demand that they rise to the level of an equal adult, you are met with the bitter, sullen rage of a child whose parent has denied them a sweet. They employ the weapons of emotional regression, passive-aggressive silence, tantrums, accusations of cruelty, and deliberate helplessness. You find yourself carrying a bizarre, irrational guilt for their failures, walking on eggshells in your own home, perpetually terrified that any demand for accountability will cause the entire structure to come crashing down upon your head. To understand the profound roots of this tragedy, we must look backward into the transgenerational currents of the family history. Across my lifetime of study, I observed that there is no greater psychological force operating upon a developing child than the unlived life of the parents. The ambitions the parents avoided, the confrontations they feared, the emotional maturity they failed to cultivate, and the psychological burdens they refused to carry are transmitted directly into the unconscious atmosphere of the home. The child who was forced, by emotional necessity, to become the parent of their own mother or father, who had to steady the emotional climate of a volatile household, who became the confidant for an unhappy parent, who learned that their safety depended entirely upon their ability to anticipate and soothe the instability of the adults around them. That child does not leave that adaptation behind in the nursery. They carry that identical adaptation into the romantic arena. When you encounter an emotionally regressed partner in your adult life, your attraction to them is not a random coincidence. They fit into an ancient, deeply worn groove in your psyche. You do not love them for their sovereignty. You love them because their helplessness is the only emotional language you know how to speak. You are playing out an ancient script that was written before you possessed the vocabulary to understand it. The cost of this dynamic is nothing less than the total forfeiture of your personal destiny. While you spend your precious years managing the emotional landscape of an adult child, your own creative gifts remain unexpressed. Your own authentic ambitions are indefinitely postponed, and the sovereign individual you were intended to become is starved of the space required to draw breath.